She laughed and stirred peanuts into my plate. My throat closed. I called 911. I watched the person I loved walk out in handcuffs. My name is Owen. I was 29 when everything collapsed. I was engaged to Jane, 27, and we'd been planning a wedding for the spring. I have a peanut allergy that isn't a funny anecdote or a trend. It's the kind that clamps your airway closed like a fist. I was diagnosed when I was 6, after a birthday party accident that nearly killed me. Since then, I've carried an EpiPen, carried medical records, learned to read menus like a litigator reads fine print. Jane knew from the start. I told her on our first weekend together because food is not a private preference for someone like me. It's life and death. At first she was careful. She said her cousin had a shellfish allergy and that she got it. But over the years, the tone changed in small, corrosive ways. Eye rolls at restaurants when I double-checked ingredients. Jokes in front of friends about how dramatic I was. A snide comment after a server spelled peanuts correctly on the menu. The little things began to stack. At her mother's house, when Thai noodles came out and I asked about peanuts in the sauce, Jane laughed and told everyone I was overcautious. Her mom was kind and explained the ingredients. But Jane later accused me of embarrassing her and blew up in the car. At parties, friends who didn't know better called me picky. Jane smiled along. I started to feel like I was the problem. Anxious, controlling, making food into drama when it should be simple. 2 months before the night that changed everything, Jane brought home pad thai. The takeout label spelled out peanuts in the sauce. I set the bowl aside. She called me ridiculous, scoffed at trace amounts, and ate it. It should have been a red flag. We'd already sent save the dates. The deposits were down for the venue. Stepping away felt like deciding against a life I'd been half building. I stayed. Arguments grew worse when travel plans were involved. She wanted to honeymoon in Southeast Asia, a dream for both of us. I reminded her that local cuisine often uses crushed peanuts. She snapped that I was ruining things and accused me of controlling the getaway. Control. The word landed like a weapon. I am not in the business of manipulating menus. I am in the business of staying alive. After that, apologies came. The kind that promised understanding and then slid back into old habits. Then the night my throat began to swell and everything finally tipped into evidence and law, I walked into that kitchen thinking it was a familiar routine, a safe spaghetti we'd had a dozen times, and walked out with a sample bag, an EpiPen spent, and the knowledge that someone I trusted had tried to prove me a liar by making me almost die. I came home from work tired in that way that makes your joints feel like mismatched parts. Jane had said she'd make dinner. Spaghetti with meat sauce is one of my safe meals. We'd cooked it together before, shared the tiny rituals, browning the meat, the garlic in the pan, the basil torn at the end. This time, the sauce tasted off from the first bite. Brighter, oddly sweet, as if something had been added. I stopped chewing. "Did you change the recipe?" I asked. She glanced up from her phone. "No, same as always." The tingling started in my tongue, a subtle betrayal. By the fourth bite, my throat felt thicker, like a scarf had been looped inside me. I stood and went for my EpiPen. The look on her face was the first time she laughed at me in a way that didn't look worried. It looked amused. "Really?" she said, "over spaghetti." I remember the panic as clinical and physical at the same time, my hands, my breath, the way my throat narrowed. I jabbed the EpiPen into my thigh. The medicine eased things, but not enough. Responders buy you time. They don't fix everything. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911. My voice was thin, but the operator heard enough. Anaphylaxis. Address. Help incoming. While I was on the phone, Jane walked over, scooped a spoonful of the sauce. "And I don't know why those actions slow down in your memory," she said. "There's nothing in here." Then, in a voice that made my skin go cold, she said, "I'll prove it. It's not peanuts. You're being dramatic." She took the jar of peanut butter from the counter and stirred a generous spoon into the pot. Casual as stirring sugar into coffee, my world narrowed to air and insistence. My throat would close unless help came. She watched me, smiling as if this were an experiment with a punchline. I kept my phone on the line with dispatch, gasping my location, trying to stay conscious. I scooped a small sample of the sauce into a plastic bag and labeled it by shaking my hand. When the EMTs arrived, they moved with the kind of practiced focus that comes from years of seeing bodies fail and fixing them. They gave oxygen, more epinephrine, via 4 antihistamines, steroids. One paramedic asked what had happened. She just admitted to putting peanut butter in the sauce, I said. Voice raw, Jane hovered, then tried to rewrite the scene. I was overreacting. She insisted I'd used an EpiPen before for anxiety. This was blown out of proportion. One paramedic, a quiet woman, looked at Jane with the kind of look that reads people quickly. We're documenting this as a possible intentional exposure, she said, and that phrase turned the living room into a custodial evidence scene. The paramedic took the bag of sauce and followed protocol. In the ambulance, the medications blurred in and out of sensation. The EMT radioed ahead, requesting police presence at the ER because of the possible deliberate exposure. At the hospital, doctors ran tests, monitored my airway, and a detective arrived to take statements. I told everything, the months of belittling, the pad thai incident, the way she'd told me I was being dramatic. I told him she'd stirred peanut butter into the sauce while I struggled to breathe. The detective left to check the evidence. He came back shortly with a bag and a preliminary field test that smelled unmistakably of peanuts. The officer arranged for Jane to be located. She'd been texting and calling me frantically. When officers found her, she was still trying to insist this was a joke gone wrong. When they told her there was a bag of sauce and an eyewitness EMT, her story faltered. In the waiting room, they read her rights. I watched as a person who had once been part of my future was led away in cuffs. The sound of the cuffs felt like thunder in a small room. Jane walked into the ER waiting area minutes later, probably thinking she'd stride in and fix everything with an apology. Instead, officers stopped her and brought her back. She claimed confusion at first, then denial, then an admission when pressed about the sample and the tape of her words. When the cuffs clicked, it sounded like a drumbeat through my chest. I sat in the hospital bed and watched the person. I'd said yes to being let out with her head down. Word moved faster than I expected. Her phone lit up with frantic calls. The first messages I saw were panic, then blame, then a chorus of people insisting I'd ruined her life over a silly mistake. Friends posted tentative defenses on social media. She didn't mean any harm. It was a joke. Family called my parents and tried to rewrite the story into something softer, a misunderstanding, a way to knock off anxiety. I blocked numbers until my phone was quiet. At the station, detectives explained the charge: assault with a deadly weapon. In our jurisdiction, knowingly administering a life-threatening allergen can meet that bar. They filed an emergency protective order to keep her a legal distance away. The restraining order made sense and also felt like closing a door in slow motion. Moving out was messy. I took what I could, left the key on the counter, and had my brother help pack the rest. The apartment, once shared and comfortable, felt vandalized. Jane had thrown things, taken some photos, and broken a few plates before I left. The legal process began like a heavy draft: bail hearings, prosecutors building a file, and a defense team hired by family friends trying to recast the act as a mistake. The prosecution assembled a stack of things that felt like anchors: the food sample, paramedic notes, my medical records tracing this allergy back decades, text messages in which Jane minimized my condition, and witness testimony about her behaviors over many months. Trial months later. Condensed into edges. EMTs described the ambulance run. Doctors explained the risk of biphasic anaphylaxis. Detectives recited Jane's own statements. The defense tried to show her as misguided and me as overbearing, but the pattern in the evidence was hard to loosen. The jury deliberated and returned a verdict that reflected the evidence: guilty of assault with a deadly weapon. When the sentence was handed down, a term with some portion suspended but a real jail component, I felt relief more than triumph. A court had acknowledged the seriousness of what she'd done. The social aftermath was brutal in a different register. Jane's family called mine and tried to recast the narrative. Friends and vendors picked sides. Our wedding vendors quietly unbooked dates after hearing the charges. Some people who had once been warm turned icy or loud on social media, calling me vindictive for involving the law. That hurt in an earthly, practical way. Deposits, plans, photographs, but it couldn't outrank the fact that I'd nearly stopped breathing. There were quieter battles. The landlord worked with me to sever the lease given the police report. My brother and father helped me move the rest of my things into storage. My parents sat through meetings with counselors with me. At work, the hospital gave me time off and connected me to counseling for survivors of domestic harm. The solidarity from colleagues who believed me mattered a lot. The trial closed a chapter, but not all the conversations. Jane served part of her sentence, with mandatory counseling and education about allergies appended to the judgment. When she was released months later, the protective order remained active. She attempted no contact. Her family continued to cast me as the villain in their telling. Strangers sometimes believed that version before learning the facts. The record in court, however, existed, and that record meant safeguards. For me, and potentially for others who might face similar disbelief, after the trial, I moved slowly through a landscape that felt both new and oddly familiar. Phone calls tapered to silence for most of Jane's circle, mine filled with voices of those who mattered. My brother, my parents, friends who came over with casserole and patience. At work, colleagues offered quiet support. The hospital's HR team gave me time to recover and connected me with counseling services for victims of domestic harm. I didn't feel victory. I felt relief in a hollow where trust used to sit. People asked if I regretted taking legal action. If I could rewind, would I have done anything differently? The answer came back simple. I wouldn't risk my life to prove a point. The law exists for cases like this, where behavior escalates past mean words to calculated risk. Pressing charges wasn't about vengeance. It was about a record, a boundary, a safeguard for anyone in that position in the future. Jane's release from custody nearly a year and a half later came without fanfare. The restraining order remains active. She's blocked. I've been careful not to let anger drive me. The court gave consequences. But healing was inside my own work, therapy, reconnecting with friends. Learning to trust smaller things again, a dinner with a friend, where someone truly checks ingredients, a partner who validates concerns without mockery. The wedding we planned evaporated. The deposits returned sometimes not. I rethreaded my future differently. It wasn't that I expected perfect safety from strangers. I expected that the people closest to me should honor my vulnerability rather than weaponize it. Do I mourn the relationship? In a practical sense, yes, we'd made plans and spent money and believed in a future. Emotionally, it's complicated. Grief for what was. Gratitude that the worst didn't happen because I acted fast enough. Sometimes the aftermath shows up unexpectedly. A grocery aisle with a peanut butter display. A notification about a delayed court date. A private message from someone who says, quietly, I almost told someone once, but I didn't. Those notes make me feel like the case mattered beyond my life. It wasn't just about punishment. It was about teaching a community that allergies are not etiquette problems. They're medical reality. If you're someone reading this and living with a severe allergy, keep your records. Tell people clearly and trust your instincts. If you're with someone who laughs at your warnings or pokes fun at your fear, listen to that as data. Patterns matter. Small cruelties can become dangerous escalations. And if something like this happens to you, document it. Save photographs, texts, any evidence. Call for help. Your life is not a test for someone else's skepticism. I'm alive. The court recorded what she did, and that record matters. Jane's family still tells a different story on weekends. Strangers might judge without context. I don't control that. What I did control was getting help, protecting myself, and creating a record that might keep someone else from being treated as a joke. That, in the end, is enough.